Part 1. From Humble Beginnings to Big Dreams. Imagine being born into a world that expects very little from you. That was Andrew Carnegie's life in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, a small, smoky industrial town where hope sometimes felt like a luxury. His family wasn't poor in the absolute sense, but they were tight on money. Andrew's father, William Carnegie, was a handloom weaver, a trade already dying as factories with machines began replacing skilled artisans. His mother, Margaret Morrison Carnegie, was industrious, sharp, and fiercely proud, running the household with a mixture of warmth and iron discipline. Young Andrew was small, weary, and endlessly curious. From a very early age, he loved to watch, listen, and learn. He didn't have books to spare, but he devoured the world around him. The bustling factories, the smell of fresh paper in the print shops, the rhythm of the trains, everything fascinated him. He noticed how people moved, how money changed hands, how business worked. He saw patterns others ignored, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a seed of ambition was planted. I want more than this. I want to see what I can become. The Carnegies immigrated to the United States when Andrew was just 13. They settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a working-class neighborhood buzzing with immigrants, steam engines, and the constant hum of industry. The move wasn't easy. They left behind the only home Andrew had ever known, saying goodbye to friends, streets, and familiar smells, all in search of a better future. It was a leap into uncertainty, but Margaret believed fiercely in education and opportunity. She often told her children, "You can rise above, but you must learn, work, and never waste a chance." Andrew started working almost immediately. He became a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, a grueling, dangerous job, moving spools of thread for hours, sometimes in dim light, often in freezing conditions. He watched the machines, noting how efficiency and timing mattered. He noticed which workers were careful and which were careless, and even in these menial tasks, he thought about ways to make things better, faster, smarter. But Andrew wasn't satisfied with labor alone. He had an unquenchable thirst for learning. He borrowed books wherever he could, attended night classes, and studied on his own, often by the dim light of a candle after long shifts. He was fascinated by history, philosophy, and the stories of men who had built empires from almost nothing. One book in particular changed him, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Franklin's story of rising from humble beginnings, learning relentlessly, and creating opportunities inspired Andrew profoundly. He realized then that ambition without action was meaningless. Knowledge alone was useless without applying it. When he was just 15, he got a job as a telegraph messenger. The job was considered lowly, but Andrew treated it like a school of business. He paid attention to the messages, learned shorthand, memorized routes, and studied the names of the men he delivered messages to: the bankers, the industrialists, the managers. By observing them, he began to understand how information and money flowed in the real world. Soon, his diligence paid off. At 16, Andrew became a telegraph operator, a position that required precision, speed, and trustworthiness. He thrived. Within the telegraph office, he met Captain Thomas Scott, a powerful man in the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott recognized Andrew's intelligence and work ethic, and he became something of a mentor. Under Scott's guidance, Andrew learned about railroads, investments, and the value of strategic thinking. Scott often reminded him, "Opportunity waits for no one. You must act when the door opens, or someone else will." Andrew Carnegie's early life teaches a subtle but powerful lesson. Opportunity often comes disguised as hard work. While other boys his age were playing, Andrew was learning, observing, and planning. His curiosity became a habit, and his habit became an advantage. He understood something critical: success wasn't just about talent or luck. It was about noticing chances others ignored and being willing to act, often before you feel ready. By the age of 20, Carnegie had moved up in the railroad industry. He had saved a small amount of money, invested wisely, and started to think about bigger ventures. But he didn't rush. He was patient, learning the rules of finance, the rhythm of markets, and the intricacies of the industrial world. He knew that building wealth wasn't about sudden windfalls, it was about compounding effort, knowledge, and decisions over time. At this stage, Carnegie also began giving small amounts to causes he believed in. Even as a young man, he felt a sense of responsibility. He had seen the hardships his family endured, the struggles of immigrants and laborers, and he understood that wealth could be used to lift others, not just oneself. It's a lesson he carried throughout his life. Success is not just personal gain, it's the ability to create opportunities for others. As part one of Andrew Carnegie's journey comes to a close, we see a young man standing at the intersection of curiosity, ambition, and action. He's no longer a bobbin boy or telegraph messenger. He's a learner, a thinker, and a man beginning to see the vast potential of the world around him. Yet, he knows that the real challenges are just ahead. The decisions he will make, the risks he will take, and the vision he will pursue are all still forming, but the foundation has been laid. And here's the hook, friends. Andrew's story is far from over. He is about to step into the world of industry, investments, and railroad empires, learning lessons that will shape him into one of the greatest philanthropists of his era. But will his ambition survive the temptations, failures, and moral dilemmas that lie ahead? How will he transform from a hard-working immigrant boy into a man whose decisions touch millions? If you want to follow Andrew Carnegie's journey from ambition to empire, stay tuned for part 2, where the story gets even more exciting and the lessons even more profound. You won't want to miss how a young man's small choices set the stage for extraordinary success. Motivational life lesson from part 1. Your beginnings don't define your destiny. Curiosity, hard work, and attention to opportunity build the foundation for extraordinary success. Small, consistent actions compound into remarkable outcomes. Part 2. Learning the rules of power, money, and timing. If part 1 was about survival and curiosity, part 2 is about awakening. Andrew Carnegie was no longer just watching the world go by. He was beginning to play the game and, more importantly, to understand its rules. In his early 20s, Carnegie worked closely with Thomas A. Scott at the Pennsylvania Railroad. This wasn't just a job, it was an education money couldn't buy. Railroads were the arteries of America's growing economy, and Scott stood at the center of it all. Every decision affected thousands of workers, millions of dollars, and entire cities. Andrew watched everything. He noticed how Scott spoke calm, confident, never rushed. He noticed how decisions were made quickly, but based on deep understanding. He noticed something else too. Power wasn't loud. It was quiet, strategic, and patient. And Andrew took notes not on paper, but in his mind. One of the most important lessons he learned during this time was about investment. Scott encouraged him to invest small amounts of money in ventures connected to the railroad, sleeping cars, bridges, and supply companies. These were not glamorous investments. They didn't make headlines, but they were necessary. Andrew hesitated at first. His family had struggled for every dollar. Losing money felt terrifying. But Scott pushed him gently and firmly. Andrew, if you only save, you'll stay small. If you invest wisely, you grow. So Andrew invested, and for the first time in his life, money started working for him. This changed everything. He realized that wealth wasn't just about hard work, it was about ownership. About placing yourself where value is created and letting time multiply your efforts. This insight would later become the backbone of his empire. But success didn't come without inner conflict. Andrew was ambitious, deeply ambitious, but he also carried the voice of his mother and his past with him. He remembered the factory floors, the long hours, the tired faces. He didn't want to become the kind of man who forgot where he came from. This tension between ambition and conscience would follow him throughout his life. Then came the American Civil War. The war disrupted everything, but it also accelerated industry. Railroads became essential. Steel, bridges, weapons. America needed them all. Andrew worked relentlessly, helping manage logistics and operations. He thrived under pressure. But war also showed him something darker. He saw how quickly men were sacrificed for profit and strategy. He saw how wealth could grow while lives were lost. These experiences quietly shaped his later beliefs about responsibility, wealth, and giving back. After the war, Andrew made a bold decision. He left the railroad industry. This shocked many people. He was young, successful, well-connected. Why leave? Because Andrew had learned something crucial. Railroads depended on steel, and steel was the future. America was expanding westward. Cities were growing upward. Bridges, buildings, railways all demanded stronger, cheaper steel. Andrew saw what others hadn't yet fully grasped. The next great fortune wouldn't be built on the railroads, but under them. This was not a safe bet. Steel manufacturing was risky, capital-intensive, and brutally competitive. Many had failed, but Andrew believed in two things: technology and scale. He traveled to Europe to study steelmaking firsthand. While others vacationed, Andrew toured factories. He asked questions. He took notes. He studied processes like the Bessemer method, which dramatically reduced the cost of steel production. And then he did something extraordinary. He didn't just adopt the technology, he improved it. Andrew believed that efficiency wasn't just about machines, it was about systems. He focused on vertical integration, controlling everything from raw materials to transportation. This allowed him to reduce costs, outperform competitors, and reinvest profits into better equipment. Slowly, quietly, Andrew Carnegie began building what would become Carnegie Steel. But success came with pressure. Andrew demanded excellence. He pushed his managers hard. He rewarded efficiency and punished waste. Some admired him, others feared him. He wasn't cruel, but he was relentless. This raises an uncomfortable truth one Andrew himself struggled with. Can you build greatness without causing pain? At this stage of his life, Andrew believed progress required sacrifice. He believed competition made industries stronger. He believed discipline created results. And to be fair, it worked. Carnegie Steel grew rapidly. Profits soared. Andrew became one of the wealthiest men in America. Newspapers praised him as a self-made success story, the embodiment of the American dream. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Workers labored long hours. Wages were tightly controlled. Tension simmered. Andrew knew this, but he distanced himself emotionally. He preferred ideas, systems, and outcomes to direct confrontation. This avoidance would later come back to haunt him. Still, Andrew was not blind to the moral weight of wealth. During this period, he began articulating an idea that would define his legacy: the gospel of wealth. He believed that extreme wealth carried moral responsibility, that the rich should not die hoarding money, nor should they give it away thoughtlessly. Instead, they should use it to create opportunities: libraries, education, knowledge. Wealth, he wrote, is a trust. This belief was genuine, but it was still theoretical. Andrew was building, accumulating, preparing. He believed his duty to society would come after success. And so, the empire grew. But here's the emotional truth. Friend to friend, every big dream has a cost. And sometimes, we don't see the full price until later. By the end of part 2, Andrew Carnegie stands tall, wealthy, powerful, respected. But he is also standing on the edge of his greatest challenges. His ideas will soon be tested. His conscience will be challenged. And one conflict will force him to confront the human consequences of ambition. And that's where the story truly deepens. If you're enjoying this journey, don't stop here. Subscribe or follow so you don't miss part 3, where Andrew Carnegie faces the hardest test of his life, one that questions power, leadership, and the true meaning of success. Life lessons from part 2. Opportunity rewards those who study deeply and act early. Wealth grows faster when money works for you. True power is often quiet, strategic, and patient. Ambition without reflection can create hidden consequences. Responsibility doesn't begin when you give, it begins when you earn. Part 3. When success meets its shadow. By the time Andrew Carnegie reached the height of his industrial power, the world saw him as a symbol of triumph. To the public, he was a legend in motion, an immigrant boy turned steel king, proof that hard work and intelligence could bend destiny. Newspapers praised him. Politicians sought his favor. Businessmen studied his methods. But behind the polished image, Andrew felt something unfamiliar: unease. Because success, when it grows too fast, casts a long shadow. Carnegie Steel was no longer just a company, it was a force. Entire towns depended on it. Thousands of families relied on its wages. And Andrew, who once carried bobbins in a factory, now sat far above the noise, making decisions that affected lives he would never meet. And then came Homestead. The Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania was one of Carnegie's most profitable plants. It was also one of the most tense. Workers there were organized, skilled, and increasingly frustrated. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions. Wages were under constant pressure. Trust between labor and management had worn thin. Andrew knew this, but instead of stepping in directly, he did what he often did when conflict felt uncomfortable: he stepped away. He left for Scotland. In his absence, he placed control in the hands of his business partner, Henry Clay Frick. A man as efficient as he was ruthless, Frick believed in absolute authority. Where Andrew preferred persuasion and philosophy, Frick preferred force and finality. When wage negotiations broke down, Frick acted decisively and harshly. He locked workers out of the plant. Guards were hired. Pinkerton agents were brought in. Barbed wire surrounded the mill like a fortress. The workers saw this not as business, but as betrayal. What followed shocked the nation. A violent confrontation erupted between workers and Pinkertons. Gunfire echoed along the river. People were injured. Some were killed. The steel mill became a battlefield. Andrew Carnegie was thousands of miles away when the news reached him. And for the first time in his life, he could not explain it away. He wrote letters. He justified decisions. He told himself that progress demanded order, that industry could not be held hostage by resistance. But deep down, he knew something had broken, not just at Homestead. Inside himself, the boy who once worked factory floors now owned them. The man who spoke of wealth as a trust now presided over violence in its pursuit. This was Andrew Carnegie's moral reckoning, and it hurt. Public opinion turned against him. Critics accused him of hypocrisy. How could a man who preached responsibility allow such brutality? How could a champion of progress ignore the suffering of workers? Andrew retreated inward. For the first time, his confidence wavered. But here's the truth: most biographies soften. Great people do not grow without failure. Sometimes the lesson comes not as a whisper, but as a wound. Andrew did not deny what happened at Homestead. Instead, it changed him. Slowly, quietly, permanently, he began to withdraw from daily operations. He delegated more. He spent more time writing, thinking, reflecting. He revisited his belief in the gospel of wealth, not as an idea, but as a responsibility waiting to be fulfilled. He asked himself difficult questions. What is the point of wealth if it costs human dignity? What legacy do I want to leave behind? When does success stop being worth the price? These were not questions of strategy. They were questions of meaning. Around this time, Andrew began planning his exit, not from life, but from accumulation. He realized something profound. There is a season for building, and a season for giving, and staying too long in the first season can rot the soul. In 1901, Andrew Carnegie made a decision that stunned the world. He sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan. The price? Over $480 million, an unimaginable sum at the time. Overnight, Andrew Carnegie became one of the richest men who had ever lived. But instead of celebrating endlessly, he felt relief. Because now, he could finally do what he believed mattered most. Give it away. But don't mistake this moment as a simple transformation. Andrew did not suddenly become perfect. He did not erase the past. He carried the weight of Homestead with him for the rest of his life. And that weight shaped how he gave. He didn't want charity that created dependence. He wanted tools, education, libraries, institutions that allowed people to rise on their own. This belief came from his own story. Books had changed his life, so he built libraries. Knowledge had opened doors, so he funded schools. Opportunity had lifted him, so he invested in opportunity for others. Yet even as he gave, critics remained. Some said it was too late. Others said it was self-serving. Andrew accepted this, because maturity had taught him something essential. You cannot control how your story is judged, only how it is lived from this moment forward. By the end of part 3, Andrew Carnegie is no longer just a titan of industry. He is a man transformed by consequence, still wealthy, still powerful, but now aware that ambition without empathy creates destruction. Aware that leadership carries invisible costs. Aware that redemption requires action, not words. And the most important part, he wasn't finished yet. In the final chapters of his life, Andrew Carnegie would attempt something almost unheard of, to give away nearly all his fortune and redefine what success truly means. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see success differently, don't stop here. Subscribe or follow so you don't miss part 4, where Andrew Carnegie's greatest mission begins not to build wealth, but to build humanity. Life lessons from part 3. Success without reflection can become destructive. Avoiding conflict doesn't remove responsibility. Real growth often comes through painful awareness. Wealth reveals character, it doesn't create it. Redemption begins when we choose meaning over ego. Part 4. Giving it all away and redefining success. When Andrew Carnegie stepped away from the steel empire, the world expected one of two things. Either he would disappear quietly into luxury, or he would spend the rest of his life defending his reputation. He did neither. Instead, he chose something far more difficult. He chose to redefine success. At the beginning of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie was one of the richest men alive. His wealth was so vast that it confused people. They didn't even know how to measure it properly. But Andrew saw his fortune not as a trophy, but as a responsibility that pressed on his chest every morning when he woke up. He once wrote a line that revealed his inner world. "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." This wasn't a slogan, it was a promise to himself. Andrew believed that wealth should circulate, not stagnate, that money hoarded was money wasted, but he also believed something subtle and important. Giving should empower, not weaken. He didn't want to hand people money and walk away. He wanted to give people ladders. So he started with what had saved him: books. Andrew remembered being a young immigrant boy with curiosity, but no access. He remembered borrowing books from a private library that had opened its doors to working-class boys one night a week. That single act had shaped his life. So he asked himself, what if every town had a door like that? That question turned into action. Over the next few decades, Andrew Carnegie funded the creation of more than 2,500 public libraries across the world, not just in America, but in Britain, Canada, and beyond. These weren't grand palaces of ego. They were simple, welcoming spaces filled with possibility. He believed that anyone rich or poor who wanted to learn should have a quiet place to do so, no permission required. And here's what made his approach unique. Communities had to commit too. They had to provide the land and promise to maintain the library. Andrew didn't want dependency, he wanted partnership. This tells us something profound about his mindset. True generosity respects dignity, but libraries were only the beginning. Andrew funded universities, teacher training institutions, scientific research, peace foundations, and cultural centers. He invested in education because he believed it was the most powerful long-term force for change. He once said, "An injury to one is an injury to all." And slowly, his life began to feel lighter. For the first time, his days were not filled with negotiations, pressures, and production targets. They were filled with letters from students, teachers, and ordinary people whose lives had changed because a door had opened. Still, Andrew was not blind to criticism. Some said he was trying to cleanse his legacy. Others said philanthropy was a way for the wealthy to control society. Andrew listened, and then he kept going, because he had learned something. Clarity teaches all of us eventually. You cannot undo the past, but you can choose the future. As he aged, Andrew grew quieter, more reflective. He spent long hours walking, thinking, writing letters by hand. He spoke less about success and more about meaning. He believed happiness did not come from winning, but from contributing. He also believed something deeply comforting. You don't have to be perfect to do good. Andrew Carnegie did not pretend his life was flawless. He acknowledged his mistakes, especially the distance he had once kept from workers and suffering. But instead of freezing in guilt, he acted. That's an important lesson for us too. Growth is not about shame. It's about responsibility. In his later years, Andrew funded peace efforts, believing that education and understanding could prevent war, Having lived through conflict and industrial violence, he longed for a world where progress didn't require bloodshed. Was he idealistic? Yes. But he believed ideals were necessary even if imperfectly realized. As Part 4 draws to a close, Andrew Carnegie is no longer a steel tycoon. He is something rarer, a man trying, sincerely, to align his power with his values. A man who learned that success is not measured by what you control, but by what you give away without losing yourself. And yet, one final question remained. What would the world remember him for? The steel? The conflict? The libraries? The ideas? The answer would come not in his lifetime, but after. If this part moved you, don't stop here. Subscribe or follow so you don't miss Part 5, the final chapter where we look at Andrew Carnegie's last years and the timeless lessons his life leaves for all of us. Life lessons from Part 4. True success includes responsibility. Giving should empower, not create dependence. You can grow beyond your past without denying it. Wealth is temporary, impact is lasting. Meaning comes from contribution, not accumulation. Part 5. What remains after the money is gone? In the final years of his life, Andrew Carnegie moved more slowly, not because his mind had dulled far from it, but because time itself had become precious. Each morning felt like a gift rather than a guarantee. He was in his 70s now, then his 80s, and the noise of industry that once filled his days had faded into a quiet hum of reflection. He lived simply, not extravagantly, not dramatically. Simply, he walked, he read, he wrote letters by hand, he listened more than he spoke. And perhaps for the first time in his life, Andrew Carnegie felt something he had rarely allowed himself before. Peace. The man who once measured his days by output and expansion now measured them by meaning. He no longer asked, "How much can I build?" He asked, "What remains when I'm gone?" This question changes a person. Andrew had given away nearly all his fortune by now, over 90% of it. Libraries stood quietly in towns he would never visit. Schools carried his name, though most students inside them had no idea who he was. Knowledge moved through generations, invisible but powerful, and that pleased him. He once said something deeply revealing. The aim of life is not to accumulate money, but to use it wisely. Notice the humility in that sentence. Not master money, not conquer the world, just use it wisely. Andrew knew the world would remember him in fragments. Some would remember the steel, some would remember Homestead, some would remember the libraries. He had made peace with that. Because maturity teaches us this: you don't get to edit your legacy, you only get to live honestly. In his final conversations, Andrew often spoke about character, not success, not strategy. Character. He believed the true measure of a life wasn't intelligence or ambition, it was how power was handled when no one was watching. He also believed that everyone, rich or poor, was given something to steward. Time, talent, influence, kindness. Wealth just made the responsibility more visible. As his health declined, Andrew reflected often on his early years, the cold rooms, the borrowed books, the long walks home from work. He remembered his mother's strength, his father's quiet dignity, and the immigrant hunger that had once burned so brightly in him. He realized something important. The boy he had been never left him. That boy's curiosity built libraries. That boy's hunger fueled ambition. That boy's memory shaped generosity. And maybe that's the final lesson of his life. You don't outgrow your beginnings, you transform them. Andrew Carnegie passed away in 1919. There was no dramatic final speech, no grand announcement, just a quiet ending. But his life didn't end. It scattered into books opened by curious hands, into classrooms filled with questions, into opportunities created for people who would never know his name, but would feel his impact. And here's where the story turns back to us. Because Andrew Carnegie's life isn't just a historical account. It's a mirror. It asks us questions gently, honestly, without judgment. What are you building right now? Who benefits from your success? What will remain after your effort is spent? You don't need wealth to ask these questions. You don't need power. You just need awareness. Andrew Carnegie's greatest achievement wasn't steel or money. It was learning when to stop accumulating and start contributing. That lesson is available to all of us right now. In small ways, in quiet choices, in everyday kindness. And maybe that's the most comforting part of his story. You don't have to change the world all at once. You just have to use what you have wisely. Final life lessons from Andrew Carnegie's journey. Your beginnings do not limit your future. Learning is the most powerful form of freedom. Wealth magnifies responsibility. Success without meaning feels empty. Giving creates a legacy that time cannot erase. A life well lived asks, who did I help rise? Thank you for staying through all 5 parts of this journey. If this story inspired you, comforted you, or made you think, subscribe, follow for more calm, meaningful life stories told like conversations between friends. Because sometimes, the stories we need most are the ones that remind us who we can become.